The story of music is the story of our species, told in 3 dimensions of sound. It begun with rhythm and dance. Before man found his voice and melody took control. The story of the 3rd dimension, from supporting role to master of the sound space, is the glorious story of Western music. Welcome to the world of harmony. Harmony is the sound you get when more than one note is played together. It's a nice word, suggesting agreement and togetherness and making everything sound pleasant and simple. But the musical concept of harmony broadens into a system of astonishing complexity, a system that underpins our entire musical culture. And I'm not just talking about classical music, but everything from praying monks to Taylor Swift. And when I say praying monks, I'm talking about the religious sort. Anyway, to understand the history of harmony, we need to take ourselves and our ears back some 2,500 years to the world of ancient Greece. Here, the philosopher stroke scientist stroke mystic cult leader Pythagoras discovered a system of harmony, which he thought revealed the inner secrets of nature and described how the stars and planets moved through space. This is of course the same Pythagoras, whose famous theory we all had to learn at school. That was describing mathematical relationships in space, and here Pythagoras attempted to do the same thing with sound. The story goes that one day Pythagoras was out walking when he heard the most beautiful sounds. They came from a blacksmith's, and when Pythagoras approached the workshop, he realised the beautiful and harmonious sounds were produced by different hammers of related sizes, striking the anvil at the same time. In other words, he was hearing harmony, and there was a mathematical relationship defining that harmony. Now, nice story, but almost certainly cobblers. Far more likely, Pythagoras was experimenting with strings. You see, notes are just vibrations. You're hearing me now because your computer speakers are vibrating, as is the air to your ears, and so finally, your eardrums themselves. If you kick a sack of potatoes, you also get vibrations, but they are low, varied and short. But if you pluck a piece of string, you get a note. Different notes are simply different frequencies of vibration. Middle C, for example, has a frequency of 264 Hz. The same thing happens if you play a flute or recorder, only now it's not a string that's vibrating, but the column of air inside the instrument, which you can shorten or lengthen using holes along the pipe. What Pythagoras realised was that if you divide the string into equal parts, you get different notes, but notes that are harmoniously related. Divide the string in half, and you get a new note that sounds the same as your first note, but higher. We call this interval the octave, and the octave is the basic unit of all harmony. And wouldn't you know it, the maths backs it up. If you take middle C, just double that frequency, you get a new note. That's the same, an octave higher. Back to our strings. If you take the string and now divide it into thirds, you get a new note that's actually exactly between the octave. And we call this note a perfect fifth. Divide the string in quarters, and you get a fourth. Now remember, these are natural intervals we are discovering, not man-made ones. You can actually see this process happening inside a string, because a string doesn't just vibrate at a single rate. There's also other tones happening at the same time, and we call these resonances overtones, and they can be captured with high-speed photography. Remember, we can't hear those resonances individually, but they thicken the overall sound of a note, and that's why a string makes a nicer tone than a computer. Now, in music, you can naturally make 5 notes out of your octave, and these 5 notes are known as the Pentatonic Scale. Any civilization that plays music will use some or all of these 5 notes as part of their music. They're a part of nature and universal to mankind. The easiest way to experience these notes is to play the black keys of a piano. The notes seem to exist happily with each other, as you can hear if I just play random ones. Now, most cultures divide their musical scale, their octave, into more than 5 parts, and how you divide that octave will define the different sort of harmonic space your music will have. Traditional Far Eastern music, for example, relies more on the pentatonic scale to achieve its sense of serene placidity and order. Middle Eastern music, on the other hand, divides the octave into many more parts, 17 or more, to produce a more exotic and spicy soundscape. Western music creates its harmonic identity by dividing the octave into 12 parts, which allows 12 different major keys. This is the structure of music that will define the music of all composers, and indeed most music artists working today. This is our common musical heritage, and it's an extraordinarily beautiful one. Previously, melody had laid the basis for our musical language. Music was derived from what were termed modes, and each mode was created out of a musical scale. In other words, a melodic line. If you could hear the music of ancient Greece, and knowledge is understandably a little sketchy on the subject, I think you would hear melos, music led by the melodic line. That's certainly how Western music started out, and to follow this we need to go back some 1,500 years. We need to find ourselves a monastery, sit down and listen. This is the kind of thing you would have heard in the earliest of Europe's monasteries just a few hundred years after Christ's death. It's a sung prayer, a form of chant we now call plain song or plain chant. It follows just a single line of melody in fairly close consecutive pitches. No other voices, no harmony. A plain song indeed. Plain song began as a way to memorise passages of scripture. You can see the same thing happening in religious prayers in a mosque or a synagogue. This style of singing began as a single voice, but inevitably that solitary voice became a chorus as more monks joined in together in what we now term unison singing. Notice how everyone is singing the same notes. More voices, but still only a single melody, and still no harmony. For hundreds of years, monks chanted together like this, monotonously, literally. But then, sometime around the 9th century AD, some bright spark somewhere had the rather clever idea of singing different notes at the same time. There were different ways to create harmony. One voice could hold a bass note in a drone, for example, whilst another sung the melody. Or the second voice could follow the first at an equidistant musical pitch. Each technique thickens the texture of the music, and yet this is still a primitive form of harmony. The musical space, although enlarged, is still rather bare, and it is still reliant on the line of melody. Hundreds of years passed again before the medieval age breathed new life into music. In musical terms, the Harmonic Discovery was actually a small step, a third added between your starting note and its fifth, creating a chord known as the major triad. But the small step of discovering these three notes provided a giant leap for Western music. Gone now is the leading power of melody. Now harmony leads in the construction of music. The complicated way of saying this is that the harmonic structure of music will now have an intense gravitational pull on the melodic line rather than the other way round. The simple way of saying this is music you can play with a guitar. No, I mean properly. Melody is now tethered to the harmonic progression of music rather than the other way round, and that defines the music of Bach just as it does the music of Beyoncé. The transformation is stunning. This 12-note system of harmonics had become pretty much established, like the rules of grammar for a language. Composers could now choose one of 12 major and 12 minor keys to compose in. Not only that, they could also change into new keys in the same piece. This presented a multitude of potential musical relationships for composers. It was musical alchemy. Now, this required a system of tuning that didn't quite fit into the absolute or just harmonics of the natural world. There's a bit of a bodge going on to get the 12-note scale to work, but it's a bodge so small that you can't hear it, or at least I can't. There are purists who believe only in just tuning rather than equal temperament, as we term our bodge system.
And these koshi bells are tuned that way, and they have an immensely positive feeling to them.
That's fine if you prefer over. And so, with our 24 key system, that's 12 major and 12 minor keys, key is now, excuse the pun, key. A piece of classical music is composed in a certain key, and that importance is reflected in the title. The composer can then explore different keys, some more distant than others, before returning to our home key for conclusion. That journey gives us the outline structure of a piece of music, its narrative, or story if you like. A journey away from home, an exploration, and then a return back, newly informed. Bach really is the master of harmony, and his key work on the subject is known as the 48. That's 2 books of preludes and fugues in every key. Just look at the first work in the book, the well-known prelude in C major. Yes, we start in C major, but soon we're off to G major. And presently F major. And all the time we're modulating between keys, even more distant ones, before returning to our home key, C major. All of this in one of the simplest pieces of classical music. This was the harmonic template that defined classical music for the next 200 years. It was only towards the end of the 19th century that composers like Richard Wagner and Richard Strauss began to push the system towards its limits. By the 20th century, the system actually was obliterated in the sort of classical music known as atonal. That's a whole story of its own, but suffice it to say, popular music in the 20th century reaffirmed the system which we all intuitively understand today. So, harmony is our third dimension of musical space, and it's the most important. It enlarges our sound, colours our music, and allows the music of composers like Bach to fill the air with the most complex yet beautiful noises ever to reach the ears of our species. So harmony, welcome.